Hi everyone, and welcome to this ExeTalk. My name is Dr. Martha Vandrei. I am a historian of ideas at the University of Exeter. Now, being a historian of ideas, I always have to explain what that means, and so I will. Now, being a historian of ideas means having to engage with a whole range of disciplines that actually aren't mine. I'm not a specialist necessarily in a lot of the things that I have to think about and address in my work. It means going into things like philosophy, classics, ancient history, all sorts of things. Anthropology, sociology, these things all have to come into my compass as a historian of ideas. But that's really exciting. It means that there's always so much for me to think about and so much for me to do. But today, in this particular talk, I'm going to talk to you about something that perhaps you might be familiar with, and that is myth. Myth, I think, is one of these really interesting ideas that ranges across boundaries. It ranges across geographic boundaries, disciplinary boundaries, and the boundaries of time. Of course, there are no boundaries of time, and even geographical boundaries are kind of culturally constructed, if you think about it, except if it's a lake or something. But the point is that myth is one of these really, really great ideas that gives us so much latitude to think about how it works in different contexts and how those contexts may or may not relate to each other. So in this talk, I'm going to really actually think about myth as something that is, well, here and now with us today in Britain, and indeed in the modern West. That's quite different, though, to what you might think about myth being. For a lot of people, myth is simply, it's Greeks, it's Romans, it's Hindu myths, it's gods and goddesses and heroes. So there's that kind of myth, which we all like that kind of myth, of course. But then there's the other kind of myth, the stuff that's just false, the stuff that's just stories that other people believe, not us. Not, the educated, modern Western types like us. No, we don't believe that sort of thing. Well, actually, my research would suggest otherwise, that actually our myth and our history really do relate quite intimately to each other. So today I'm going to talk about two specific examples of how this works in modern British society, how we can find myth and what we can think about when we look at it as myth and not necessarily just as, well, history. This is the first example. This is someone you probably all recognize. This is Queen Boudicca. She was, remains famous for apparently leading a rebellion against the Roman invaders in the year 61 AD. There she is on her chariot. This is a statue that's actually on Westminster Bridge. It was created by Thomas Thornycroft, put up in 1902. The chariot itself is actually fairly accurate. We know this because it looks like a chariot that's described by Julius Caesar in his book, The Gallic Wars, which Thomas Thornycroft read. But aside from that, there isn't much about Boudicca that we can say for sure, actually. We know that there are two mentions of Boudicca in the ancient sources, one of which comes from Tacitus, Roman historian, the other from Diocasius, Greek historian. They both mention Boudicca, but they don't tell us much in detail. And that's really quite strange, because I'm sure most of you will have heard of Queen Boudicca. Most of you will know about the rebellion. But where do we get it from? It's just from those two sources. But I have it on good authority. I'm American, so it didn't happen to me. But apparently, children in Britain are taught about Boudicca first of all. That's the first thing they learn, because it's a good story. It's an interesting story. This lady gets really angry. She's got a big spear. She goes after people. It's fun. So you're all familiar with this story. But yes, it only comes from these two sources. Then, somehow, from those two ancient sources, you get things like Thomas Thornycroft's statue, and you get things like this. This is a woodcut of Queen Boudicca, taken from Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles, 1577. Boudicca here looks an awful lot like Queen Elizabeth, and there's a very good reason for that. Obviously, you want to, if your Queen Elizabeth happens to be on the throne, you certainly want to, big her up a bit, don't you? So you compare her to the first ancient warrior queen, Boudicca. But following that, we get lots of cultural depictions of Boudicca. 19th century, 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, into the 21st century. And what's really, really interesting is that Boudica here is being created not by historians. She's not just being, dug up by archaeologists and historians trying to find the facts, trying to, pin down exactly who she was and where she was and all that sort of factual detail. No, this is actually being created by cultural actors, by playwrights, by poets, by novelists, by filmmakers, people who are not professional historians. That's what I find so interesting. So many of our historical stories aren't from historians. They don't come from professional historians. They come from people like us, you, other people. That's what I find really interesting. But I think that that can tell us something about this relationship between history and myth. Myth is something that we can all believe. It's actually something that doesn't have to be created by a historian. It doesn't have to be created by anybody. It's something that we all collectively own. We almost co-produce it, you could say. So that's a fairly well-known example, Queen Boudicca. This is a less well-known example, at least in Britain, I think. Possibly not today, but certainly until fairly recently. This is a fairly unknown or not very well understood story in Britain. Quite different in America. This is a postcard of the Mayflower, which is famous in America. It is basically our origin story. The idea that the Mayflower brought religiously persecuted, quote-unquote, pilgrims from the shores of Britain up to the New World into America, where they could live in freedom and in peace. Of course, they didn't. They didn't live in peace at all. They were really mean. But that's kind of beside the point, because of course, when we tell origin stories, when we tell myths, we leave out the bad bits. So we left out the bad bits. I learned about the Mayflower Pilgrims when I was a little kid, and every little kid in America learns the same stories. As I say, in Britain, it hasn't had the same kind of cultural purchase for quite obvious reasons. We do want to leave the bad bits out, so if these guys were fleeing from being persecuted in Britain, we probably don't want to tell that story to little kids in Britain because, we want to talk about other things, like Boudicca. But the Mayflower story became far more culturally symbolic over time. So by the 19th, 20th centuries, people were starting to think about it, not necessarily to teach it to little kids, but to think about it in terms of, well, what can we do with this in cultural diplomacy-wise? How can we build an Anglo-American relationship based on shared stories like this? That becomes especially important around the First World War. The Americans stayed out of the war until April 1917, when they entered the war on the side of the Allies, which is to say the British and their allies, and they became involved in the war effort. So in 1917, 1918, this story becomes very important because it looks for all the world as if 1620 was foreshadowing something that was to happen in 1917, 1918. So by 1920, people are thinking, hey, let's have a tercentenary. Let's have a celebration. Let's really bring this into the popular imagination. And one of the main protagonists behind that effort is this guy, James Randall Harris, who's a bit of a kind of Indiana Jones type figure. Not necessarily there, he was a bit older there, but in his youth, he certainly would run around different parts of the world, digging up artifacts, looking for old manuscripts. He was very well read in ancient languages, in ancient Greek and Sanskrit. So he was always looking for, old bits of papyrus or, a bit of a relic here or an artifact there. And he built up a large collection, which I'll show you in a moment. But Randall Harris is really interesting also because he was, in effect, an anthropologist. He was interested not just in stuff, not just in material culture. He was interested in memory, in folk culture, in folk stories, in traditions, customs, and rituals, things that could be retold. That's what he was interested in. So you often find him just gathering together little bits of stories that he's heard when he's wandering around Armenia or something like that. But he arrives, well, he lives in Britain anyway, but he was on a trip and he was torpedoed at sea, actually, in 1917, in indeed April 1917. Coincidence. And he comes back to Britain and he thinks, we need to have this celebration. We need to bring this Anglo-American relationship into the popular imagination, because we cannot have another war like the one we've just had, or are having. So he starts this kind of, we really need to get this going. And actually, by coincidence, around 1918, he hears a story from deepest, darkest Buckinghamshire, of all places, that a barn, known locally as the Mayflower Barn, was actually built from the timbers of the Mayflower. And so he goes nuts. He goes in full-on research mode. He goes to every archive he can think of. He goes and he talks to people, he interviews people, he goes to shipbuilders, he gets shipbuilders to come in, he gets a photographer to come in. You know, he wants to make this into the Mayflower, even if it isn't. But he's gonna try his best. He really does want to prove this, though. He wants to prove this, that folk memory is, as he says, as valid as a record in the archive. So he does things like go in, he gets his photographer friends to come around. He keeps all this in a scrapbook, by the way. It's all in his archive, and he indeed publishes quite a lot of it. But he gets, photographers to come in to show things like this really quite high quality for its time photograph of the interior of the barn. This is an inverted ship. We know that, actually. He did get his shipbuilders to come in and prove that. But was it the Mayflower? Possibly, possibly not. It certainly was a ship, anyway. And you can actually see it's basically an inverted hull. So there's this, he finds that's pretty good evidence, decent. But then he does things like, well, hey, look at that. That's got to say, that incised beam, that definitely says Mayflower, Harwich, definitely. Harwich being the port where the Mayflower was actually constructed. In fact, it's probably just a bit of scratch, as you'd get in any old barn. But he's really convinced, or at least he wants to be convinced, and he wants other people to be convinced. And the interesting thing is that they want to be convinced too. And so you get lots of people descending on this barn because they're convinced. They want it to be the Mayflower, so they're going to go and treat it that way. That's what myth does. Myth does something that history just can't. You can have all the facts in the world, but actually what people really want is the story. And so they believe this story. And then here, on the other side, you get, this is a picture of, in the newspaper clipping, Mayflower relic of American for the American Peace Portal. This is actually a delegation from America who have come to Buckinghamshire to take a bit of this barn back with them to put into a monument, which is going to stand on the border between Canada and America, representing Anglo-American togetherness. They really did want to believe it. They went to this ceremony, they took that bit of the barn. That's the actual bit that's ended up in the memorial. They did put Mayflower on it, clearly. That wasn't there before. So, but that's the really interesting thing. It's just this, it just became its own beast. It couldn't be controlled after this. And I don't think anybody wanted it to be, because again, myths are great. We love myths. So I said earlier that James Randall Harris was something of an Indiana Jones. He went around to different parts of the world. He was always looking for that next discovery, that next big thing. But he doesn't just do this in the other parts of the world where people believe myths. He does it in Britain. So he goes off and he does research the Mayflower Barn. He does the same thing in other parts of the world. He's always looking for the origins of myths, for what they mean, for what they actually tell us about the communities that make those myths and tell those myths. And so this is just a sort of a range of examples of his collection. So you've got things like he's trying to figure out who built Stonehenge. He had this notion that the oldest kind of religion was the worship of twins. He had all sorts of strange ideas, but he didn't think that Britain was different. He thought Britain was just a part of this big global culture, that actually this is just how humans behave. They tell stories because they like to tell stories, not because they're true or definitely based in fact, but because they like it. That's, I think, what we can really learn here from these two stories, but especially, I think, from James Randall Harris and his sort of practice, really. He has this wonderful quote, "For me, the whole quest is a romance, a chase, a mystery, a delight." This quote really resonates with me because I know a lot of professional historians. Most of them will say, oh, no, I don't do myth. I don't do tradition. I don't do, I don't do fiction. But we do. We love it. That's why we became historians, not because we like digging up facts, but because we like telling stories, we like hearing stories, we like thinking about human experience. That's why I became a historian. And yeah, that's why that quote really means something to me. And I think that's something we have to kind of remember, not just as historians, but actually as anybody who's interested in the past. Doing history isn't just about telling you the facts. It's actually about bringing the past back to life. And that's, I think, what myth can help us to think about. It can help us to think about life. Yeah. So thank you ever so much for listening. And yeah, I hope that you enjoyed that. Thank you.